For the sake of time, we're going to keep moving along here with presentations. The next lamprey talk is from Trent Sutton up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And he's going to hone in more on Alaska's lamprey, tell us what we need, what we know, what we don't know, and highlight some of the conservation concerns. Hey, Trent, good to see you, and take it away.
Yeah, you too, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. And let me get my screen shared here. And there we go. Hopefully that shows my opening title slide. All right, so thanks for the opportunity to be here today to talk about what is probably my favorite group of fish, and something I've had the blessed opportunity over my entire career to work on. I started working on lamprey as a graduate student many moons ago, and I've gotten the opportunity to work with them over the years since then. And what I want to talk a bit about today is what we know, and unfortunately in many cases what we don't know about Alaska's lamprey species. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge my co-author Sabrina Garcia from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So as Christina mentioned a few moments ago, we have 5 lamprey species in Alaska, which is pretty interesting that we have that high of a diversity. I'm going to focus on the bottom 3 species, in part because the first 2 species listed here, Western brook lamprey and Western river lamprey, were only at the very northern extent of their geographic range. They only occur in southeastern Alaska. There have been no dedicated studies focusing on those 2 species. And in short, we know nothing about them in Alaska anyway. But the bottom 3 species we know a little bit more about, some species more than others. And they're really interesting because during their juvenile life stage, they're very different from one another. So for example, Pacific lamprey are anadromous and parasitic. Alaskan brook lamprey are freshwater resident and non-parasitic. They don't feed at all during the juvenile life stage. They metamorphose to an adult and then spawn and die. And then Arctic lamprey are anadromous and predatory, which is a little bit different than what most people think about when they think about lamprey. So my focus is going to be on those 3 species. And I'm going to tie into this not just about what we know and don't know about lamprey, but also the Susitna River drainage as well, because that's really some sort of new focus in terms of lamprey research is starting to take place. So what do we know? First off, Pacific lamprey, we're at the northern extent of their geographic range in Alaska. We know that spawning populations exist in southeastern Alaska and in south central Alaska. And the belief currently is that the Susitna River drainage is the northernmost spawning drainage for this particular species. They do occur in other parts of Alaska during the juvenile marine phase feeding stage out in the Bering Sea and northern Gulf of Alaska. So they are found elsewhere. As far as their population status goes, we know nothing about that. We don't know how many Pacific lamprey return to spawn each year. We don't know how many are out in the ocean. It's basically a big black box. And for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of research focusing on Pacific lamprey. It's fairly recent. There's been a bit of work in this Susitna River drainage, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. And there are some upcoming projects through PLCI, the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative, through the RIP process, the Regional Implementation Plans. One proposal that is going to be funded and one that is pending and looks very promising. So there should be an increase in our understanding of this particular species in the coming years, at least in the Susitna River drainage. And like I said, I'll come back to that in a few moments. There have been a couple of other collections that have taken place for Pacific lamprey in recent years in the Copper River and also in the Bering Sea during the juvenile marine phase feeding life stage. But by and large, we know very little about Pacific lamprey in Alaska. And if I had to characterize our knowledge base to date, is sort of at its infancy. We just don't know much about the species. But thanks to the BLCI, there's definitely a lot more interest in this particular species in Alaska. Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey are 2 species we know a fair bit more about, and I'll come back to why that is here in a minute. These are paired species, so you often find them in the same distributions or same systems together, drainages together. Their distribution is shifted a little more northern than what we see with Pacific lamprey. So the Susitna River drainage actually is the southernmost drainage that we see both species spawning in. So the Susitna River is really unique in that it has all 3 species in it. It might be the only system in Alaska that has all 3 species in it. They spawn in the Kuskokwim River drainage, they spawn on the Yukon River drainage, they spawn in all the tributaries in between those various large drainages. there is reports of Arctic lamprey, at least in the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea. But we also find Arctic lamprey, at least in the Bering Sea and the northern Gulf of Alaska during the marine phase juvenile life stage. As far as population status goes, largely unknown, which is a bit surprising given that for Arctic lamprey in the lower Yukon River, there is a subsistence and a commercial fishery. And I'll come back to that here in a second. There has been more research conducted on Arctic lamprey and sort of indirectly on Alaskan brook lamprey. Most of that is focused in the Yukon River drainage. There's been a little bit in the Kuskokwim River, a little bit in the Susitna River drainage, but most of the collections have taken place in the Yukon River to date, by far and away. A little bit in the Susitna River drainage, and then some collections that have taken place in the Bering Sea, focusing on the juvenile life stage. And the reason that Arctic lamprey in particular have been focused on, at least in the lower Yukon River, is because of this subsistence and commercial fishery. The subsistence harvest has taken place for hundreds of years. The commercial fishery is relatively new, since 2003. And so because of that, there's a need to monitor to make sure that harvest the harvest is sustainable. And so there's been a test fishery that's been ongoing since the beginning of the commercial fishery. And through that effort, basically what it does is they're using hoop nets and fyke nets and standardized sampling locations every fall, are collecting Arctic lampreys. Are beginning their upstream spawning migration from the Bering Sea into the Yukon River. They have standardized locations, so they're able to track that and look at run timing and run strength. And one of the goals in 2016 through 2018 was to tag Arctic lamprey using external T-bar anchor tags, conduct a marker capture study with the goal of trying to get an estimate of population abundance. And they tagged over 9,000 lamprey and got very few returns. And so the question is, what happened? Is it because the tags fell out? Is it because the lamprey were returning somewhere else? No one seemed to know. And so unfortunately, it raised more questions than what it answered, but it pointed out a definite need that we need to get a better handle on how many lamprey are returning to spawn each year, because like I said, we have this, in some years, quite substantial commercial fishery, which I'll show a bit of data here in a second. But the numbers of participants in this fishery vary from year to year. The harvest varies from year to year. The gear types that are used are hoop nets and fyke nets, but also more commonly dip nets. And as you can see in the middle picture, what are called eel sticks. So these are wooden poles with a hook on the end. And as the lamprey are swimming under the ice, this is the fall fishery, they cut holes in the ice and they scoop the lamprey out onto the ice. And so using, again, primarily dip nets and these eel sticks. The location of the fishery on the lower map inset there is from Mountain Village up through Grayling. Again, the timing of this fishery is from the beginning of October through mid-December. That's when the fishery is open. And it's all based on run timing, when the run is at various locations as the lamprey are moving their way upstream. And most of the run takes place about this time of year, usually in mid to late November, right around Thanksgiving, roughly. This is a plot that shows the entire lifespan of the commercial fishery from 2003 to 2020. The orange bars are the harvest in pounds. The black dots are the number of lampreys harvested each year in thousands. And then the white dollar value above each dot is the total dollar value of the lamprey harvest that particular year. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation from year to year in terms of the numbers of lamprey that are harvested or not harvested in some cases, the dollar value of the fishery. But what's most interesting is that over the last 5 years, lamprey harvest has been quite low. And the question is, why is that? Is it because that run strength is low? Is it because that run timing has changed? Is it because of climate change, which has changed the timing of ice up and pushed it later in the fall? And so maybe the fishers aren't able to get out and harvest, or is it some combination of all of these? And the answer is nobody knows this. And so there's definitely a need to try to figure out what's going on for this particular fishery. And so as a result, over the last decade, there's been a fair bit of research focused on Arctic lamprey. And so, for example, we've done some work up here in interior Alaska looking at distribution life history of Arctic and Alaskan brook lamprey and various tributaries of the Tanana River, which is a tributary of the Yukon River. One of my former grad students, Katie Schenk, that I co-advised along with Andreas Lopez, looked at the population structure, the genetic structure of larval lamprey in the Chena, Gasaza, and Andreevsky River, which are tributaries of the Yukon River. Katie also looked at using eDNA, the gut contents of juvenile Arctic lamprey collected from the Bering Sea and looked at their diet composition and found some really interesting things, which confirmed the fact they're predatory and not parasitic like we believe for most lamprey species. I currently have a grad student, Mary Spanos, who's kind of tackled this issue of the mark recapture study that didn't go as planned. And we were able to bring in a Arctic lamprey that we're starting their spawning migration into the lab here at UAF and conduct a tag retention study looking at T-bar anchor, external T-bar anchor tags, as well as internally implanted transmitters of various sizes, and what kind of retention did we get, how did that affect swimming performance, to see if that had an effect on lamprey. And we'll be having those results come out later this coming spring. And then more recently, Sabrina and I have been able to access some of the out-migrating smolt data. So there's a study that's been taking place for a number of years in the lower Yukon River, focused on smolts of Chinook salmon and their out-migration, but along with that, at the same time, Arctic lamprey smolts are out-migrating too. So we're going to look at those data, looking at run timing as well as size structure. And so we'll be looking at more of that here in the years to come. How this all kind of ties together and what are we sort of getting at here is that most of the focus has been on Arctic lamprey in the lower Yukon River because of the fishery. And there hasn't been much focus on other lamprey species and other drainages, but that's changing in part because of the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. We were able to get some funding in 2019 to conduct a small scale pilot study in the Susitna River. Could we find Pacific lamprey, because we knew they spawn in that system? So we went out and conducted field sampling using backpack electrofishing and dip net surveys, and conducted a whole suite of physical habitat data, as well as chemical habitat data. We collected water samples to look at eDNA to see a presence, absence of lampreys, brought all this back to the lab and processed it. And the systems we sampled in the Susitna River drainage were 6 tributaries from top to bottom: Rabbitoh, Birch, Montana, Caswell, Willow, and Meadow Creeks. Primarily areas that were road accessible. These were day trip canoe surveys and wading surveys. And what we found in those 6 tributaries, we found lampreys in all 6 tributaries. And we also found all 3 species. And so mostly what we found were larval lamprey. We found 63 larval Lethenteron. So those are larval Alaskan brook or Arctic lamprey. We can't distinguish them at the larval life stage. We found 12 adult spawning stage Alaskan brook lamprey. We collected 1 dead spawned out adult Arctic lamprey and 1 dead spawned out Pacific lamprey. And that's that bottom picture there. So we were able to find in all 6 tributaries, all 3 species, not all 3 species every tributary, but all 3 species among those tributaries, different life stages, different sizes. So that was a really successful outcome. But again, very narrow focus. It was only during June, so a very short period of time and a very small spatial extent. Where things are heading, we actually gotten some additional funding. We'll have some additional funding to expand that survey. Again, the same 6 tributaries, but expand the spatial extent of sampling and also expand the temporal nature of sampling. So not just sampling in June, but June, July, and August over 2 separate years, 2022 and 2023. And then we have another proposal pending that, if funded, will allow us to, again, continue to sample in those same 6 tributaries, but expand to an additional 6 tributaries. So again, our spatial and temporal extent will expand as well. And so with that, if we have time for any questions, I'm more than happy to entertain those. But if you have ever encountered lamprey, collected lamprey, or interested in partnering with us on this lamprey project in the Susitna River drainage, please contact either Sabrina or myself. Both of our email addresses are there. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Trent, and good to see that work is going on in the Susitna. That's very cool. Yeah, we in an effort to stay on schedule here, we will keep moving along and forego any questions and move on to the next presentation here.